I didn't get as far as I wanted to today in class, so I wanted to take the opportunity to go through the critical reading and what it is and some strategies that will help you as we move through the course. So, we talked about what a text is and what it's not. So, essentially, a text is anything that can be read, anything that conveys material. It's not limited to words on a page or print. You can read pictures, you can read road signs, you can read maps, right? Anything that conveys information that you can kind of interpret, that counts as a text. For example, when you write your first paper for me, you're going to be analyzing two texts, but they're not texts that you read in a traditional kind of way. They're films, right? So anything really, like I said, that conveys information or that can be interpreted counts as a text. When we think about critical reading, another word for that is active reading, and that's not the same as passive reading. I asked a question in class about how many of you have ever started reading something and 20 minutes later you're lost and you can't tell the person next to you what you've read. Well, that's the difference between active reading and passive reading. Passive reading essentially is reading without a purpose, if that makes sense. So I intended in class to go through and ask you guys whether you thought each of these things were active or passive, but I want to just go through really quickly. Reading each text the same way is passive reading. When you read actively, you want to adjust how you read depending on the type of text and context within which you're reading. So depending on the type of text is going to be dependent on how you read it. You want to examine the purpose of the assignment before reading. So if you're asked to read something, make sure you know with what purpose you intend I'm losing my words. You want to think about why you're reading it in the first place. Are you going to be asked to write something about it? Are you going to be asked to, are you going to be tested on that information? So the purpose of your reading depends on how you read the text. Reading without examining the purpose of the reading assignment is passive. So jumping right in and go, like without thinking, having a clear kind of idea in mind about the purpose of reading, the context of why you're reading, is an active passive reading. Instead, to be an active reader, you want to preview a text before reading it. You can skim, you can look at headings, you can look at topic sentences, you can look at keywords, any of those things to give you an indication of what the text is about. Look at titles. So for example, the hashtag shame on you article that I gave you guys, don't start reading it yet, but that I gave you guys in class as part of for your summary response. It's the article that you're going to write your summary response on. The title in and of itself tells you or gives you an indication about what the article and the message is about. In addition to previewing the text, you want to have questions in mind as you read. Instead of asking, wait, I should be thinking about this. So read with questions in mind. Who is my author's audience? What is the message that she's trying to convey? How is she trying to convey it? How does she prove her point? Those are the types of questions that you want to have in mind as you read. Also, instead of reading 30 pages, I've got things to do, there's no stopping for me, you want to take the time as an active reader to monitor your understanding of the text as you read. If you get past 2 pages and you can't articulate what's happened in the last 30 or the last 2 pages, you may want to back up and rethink and take more time to read the passages that you're asked to read. to help monitor your understanding and to help kind of engage with the text actively. Annotating while you read is a really good idea. Read with a pen in hand and mark important passages and jot down notes, write question marks if you're unsure of something. If it sounds interesting or if it's something you want to explore later, note that rather than just reading, because annotating a text can help you when it comes to completing whatever the purpose of the assignment is. You also want to make time to reflect upon and evaluate what you've read. And a lot of times that's going to come when you look at the assignment. Think about what you've read and whether it's an effective text, whether you have questions. Why is it important that you've been asked to read this text rather than not making time to reflect on it and evaluate? Because ultimately, chances are, for if you're reading something, if you're reading a text for an assignment, ultimately you're going to have to reflect and evaluate in some way what you've read. So, goals for critical reading. It's always important when you're reading something critically to identify the argument. All texts, I don't care what they are, have an argument. They have a point, they have a position, they have some sort of message that they want to get across. You also want to recognize the author's purpose or intent, and we're going to talk more about that later Wednesday when I see you. In order to kind of recognize the author's purpose or intent, you want to look at the author's tone and the strategies, the rhetorical strategies that he or she uses. And we're going to talk a lot about tone on Wednesday as well. And tone, intent, argument also kind of leads into that idea of bias. I don't care what it is, unless it's some sort of scientific, informative document. And even then, there's going to be some sort of position or bias. There's always going to be a bias in what you read. That's not a bad thing as long as you're able to identify those biases. And then, of course, the last goal for critical reading is probably the most important, is to develop an informed response based on the author's argument, details, evidence, analysis, and conclusions. So you're going to have to respond in some way or engage with what you've read in some way. Some strategies for critical reading. You want to consider your purpose. What's the reason for reading? Are you scanning for information? Are you getting an overview of the text? Are you going to relate new content to existing knowledge? Are you reading to write something, to critique an argument, to learn something? Or are you just reading for general comprehension? Whatever your purpose is going to dictate how you read the text. You want to preview the text. And like I said in the little list that I went through, you want to make sure that you skim the text for basic ideas. Look at the title, subtitles, and headings. Check out the first and the last paragraphs, because they're going to tell you, they're going to give you an indication about what the rest of the paper is about, and you go with those that information in mind. You also want to look at visuals if there are visuals, because that can be telling as well as to what is in the content of the message of the text. Consider the context. What's the author's purpose, the intended audience, genre, what do I know about the author, and what is her his or her stance or position. And when we get together on Wednesday, we're going to do a little bit more with these kinds of phrases and these kinds of concepts, and apply it to the hashtag shame on you. And then you want to look at the larger context. What's motivating the writer? Are they responding to other arguments? Are they creating something new? And then you also want to look at the so what. What's the larger implication? Why does it matter, and why is it important? And how can I connect my ideas to that larger concept? So that's all I have in about 10 minutes. I've taken 10 minutes of your time. Oh, and one more thing, and this is where we'll pick up on Wednesday. Um, in order to gauge your understanding with critical reading, you want to be able to summarize what you've read and then in some way respond. And this is what we're going to pick up with on Wednesday when I see you. So I appreciate you guys taking the 10 minutes to look through these notes. Let me know, bring any questions you may have to class if you have any questions about this. But we're going to work more with these strategies on Wednesday when I see you. And these kinds of ideas and strategies are going to coincide with your summary response assignment that is due at the end of the week. So that's it. That's all I have for you. And I look forward to seeing you guys again Wednesday.